So really good to have you all here today for our DarkFoxDen talk on the topic of trauma and recovery after a shooting. We have two great experts with us, and
Hey,
we're
welcome everybody. So glad to see you today. My name is Karen. I'm a licensed professional counselor from Alabama who specializes in mass casualty care. Usually what happens after the bad things happen, but I am so thrilled to be a part of this particular group because we're trying to get on the front end of things here. I also work in disaster services with the Red Cross. So I'm just here to participate and meet everybody and make some headway.
love it. Excellent. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, hi. To complement what Karen mentioned, I'm also with the Red Cross. I've done a lot of disaster services and first responding to events. Was a college counselor for a lot of years. I'm an LPC, also the lead for Connecticut and Rhode Island for disaster mental health services. Like Karen, probably been to a lot of sites like the Vegas shootings, the Sandy Hook shootings, Katrina, Harvey bombings, plane crashes, those kinds of things. So that first response effort, if you will. So we hope to enlighten you today about that and other things you can do to help that healing process.
And my name is Brian Van Brunt, and I've been a therapist and counselor for about 20 years or so, done a lot of work in the topics of behavioral threat assessment and behavioral intervention care teams. All during my career, I was an EMT for a little bit and also did work on critical incident stress management. So doing some work there with law enforcement and EMTs and postvention. And for really any college counseling center directors, part of our work is always thinking about that kind of response piece and preparedness part for folks. So that's just a little bit more about myself. So I guess the first thing I want to just highlight is that every time we talk about grief and trauma, that everyone responds differently to grief and trauma. And I think that's an important distinction, that not assuming that everyone's going to go through this the exact same way and that we're going to have different experiences, and that it really is a very unique journey for individuals. The Kubler-Ross model or cycle is, we'd be remiss not talking about it. It has been around for a while. There's been some great books. And Dave, I might ask you if you recall the book that Derek wrote from ACA. I'm blanking on it, but I know it was a great book kind of re-exploring this for college counselors. If we find that link, that might be a neat one to drop in as well.
Yeah.
But the grief stages that we've all heard before, the idea of denial, sort of pushing against the reality of this, the anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And this model was really one around people going through a terminal illness or a death experience themselves. It's often been borrowed to talk about the stages of grief that we go through. One of those points I'll kind of lean into, Dave and Karen, on this one, so I'll ask you both a question. My take on these stages is they have, over the years, really moved away from being something that was seen as a linear progression or like a hierarchy, but much more jump in and pop in where you go, that there's a lot of commonality here. But most people, think about the grief cycle like this, as you go through it, the reality is it looks a little more like this, that you're jumping in between all of these. So one of the things I try to teach when we're talking to people going through something is that there's no one right way to do it. So maybe I'll pass to Karen first and then Dave to kind of clarify some of those thoughts or add.
Sure. I just actually used this. I saw this particular diagram, and it is so true. I think people who are going through grief and loss feel like there's some kind of timeline, especially with everybody around them is saying, you'll get over this in time. Some of the things that the people surrounding those who are suffering grief and loss can make them feel like there's some kind of structure to it, but it's really not. It's so non-linear. We can go in and out of these parts of grief and loss and then go back to where we started. So that's been my general experience with people who are grieving loss.
Spot on, Karen. It's all over the place depending upon the individual. And I used this just last week in a hospital that suffered two deaths a day apart. One doctor, one nurse, unexpectedly. And when I put this up, everybody just nodded and said, yeah, that's exactly where I'm at a couple of days later. I don't know where to be with this. So it's about starting to reconcile what happened. And we'll talk more about that as we go on.
And this might even be the book. It might not be, but this might be a hint, Bethany. I feel like she's doing a little Where's Waldo behind the scenes, trying to sort this out for us. Seeing this as an individualized process. In the counseling space, we talk a lot about regular grief, if I can, and complex grief. The theories are, and again, this is probably an opinion that we can talk through a little bit, but I've often seen this as our temptation is to sometimes see, let's throw all the resources at everybody all at once after a tragedy. And I think some of the better thinking in that space is to be a little bit more thoughtful about layered responses. I think a little bit towards almost the antibacterial soap model. Maybe this isn't holding up under COVID, but sort of if we always give antibiotics or antibacterial soap to everyone for everything, it creates like the superbugs. The idea being that we want to lean into group resilience and community resilience as well, and have a layered response. So if someone's having by complex grief, we're talking about grief that doesn't resolve, could turn into, from an adjustment disorder, perhaps all the way to post-traumatic stress disorder or something more, devastating or getting in the way of someone's daily life activities, that at those stages, we're looking at really deploying counselors and therapists and more professionals. The idea of deploying everything all at once isn't always the best approach there. And actually, let me lean again into our two experts on this. Dave, you want to take that first? Do you have some basic ideas on the issue of grief response?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, in a nutshell, again, it's always individual. I think also you have to be very ready to respond to that grief as an institution, as a college, as a school, as a business. The second thing to that is when you're acknowledging grief, and especially when you have mass casualties or a large number of deaths, you've got to remember to extract the people that are close to the scenario pretty quickly, because we all have adrenaline, we all rush in, we all want to do good things for people that are suffering. But if you're close to the experience, you've got to back that up, because you've got to process some of that as well by yourself. So it's just important that we realize that the part about denial is really, for me, the part about the shock of what happened and how it happened. And that could be one death, it could be multiple. I think it's just intensified when you have multiple deaths on any scene, 2, 3, 4, 5, dozens, perhaps hundreds. And it's that much longer to kind of wrap your arms around that grieving process. So Karen, you want to add a little bit to that?
I was just going to say, in my experience in arriving in situations where there have been a lot of loss, we tend to, if we get there immediately, it's almost like we're standing around for a little while, like nobody needs anything, because of that shock factor, especially if trauma is involved. And just like, us as human beings and professionals, it may take us a couple of days to start to be able to really process what's happened and try to make sense of it and at least gather some facts. So that would be my input here, is just that, immediate response is great response, but it's not always going to capture the entirety.
I think there's a range in terms of how people might respond as well to this. And there was a chart that we found that I found useful here, that many of us experience this kind of resiliency and pass through and do just fine in terms of our normal grief response. Others experience a longer recovery period. Still others experience chronic stress, and others a delayed reaction that might occur over time. So it's probably worth mentioning that different cultures think about this differently in terms of grief, in terms of loss of a loved one, how we put into perspective things like meaning, spirituality, religion. All of these things can be supports for individuals. I think, some of the good advice I'd give you in this space is to have everything on your table of options, and to only bring those things out when they seem appropriate and useful for that individual. As a college counselor, there was exactly one client that I treated out of several thousand, probably over my career, where we took a Bible out of the office and read some scripture together. That was not something I did frequently, but for this one client, it was a request that he had. It was something that he found solace in, and he wanted to show me one of these verses. And I think There was, other folks might say, well, you bring religion into counseling, and is that it really is reading that person's need and having some ability to either meet them where they're at or connect them to someone who's able to kind of take it from there. I think that's an important. Just a couple slides here. We'll make these available for you, as we mentioned. So you're welcome to, take these, share with your community. I think that's important for folks, but there's a lot of lists out there. You might be experiencing things like fatigue, increased susceptibility to illness, the zombie effect, just kind of zoned out, or sometimes we call this like 1,000-yard stare. We see this a lot in first responders. I won't even show you pictures. I think it's just too much, but like after an event, something of the magnitude like 9/11 or a big event like that, where there's a number of people wandering around, you're going to see that zombie effect right afterwards, this 1,000-yard stare, this stunned experience, and this shutting down of what might be going on. Other things you might experience: difficulty thinking, continuous crying, holding on to an emotion, or an inability to cry. And this is when you put up a list like this, a lot of it really does become this constant list of things. And you look at it at the end, again, back to Dave and Karen on this. When I look at the list of all the things you can experience in grief, right? Isn't it everything? I mean, isn't that kind of where it lands? There's nothing that's really out of sorts there. When you think about grief response that you've seen in your role, either as a paramedic, as a counselor, and the work that you're doing now, what are some common reactions that you see that come to mind from people, responding to, whether it's an active shooting event or something that they witnessed in person, or even a distant event? I don't want to rule out events where something might not have happened directly to them, but they're very upset or worried or concerned about something that happened somewhere else that might have an impact on them.
One of the things that I've noticed is a crisis for one person may not be a crisis for another. So a lot of it has to do with how we perceive what we've just witnessed, or what we've heard about, or what we're seeing on the scene. And I think, again, we said individualized a minute ago. It really is an individualized scenario as to how someone responds. But I know I hear people who have been exposed to these type of events and traumas repeatedly, that they generally don't have a strong reaction like someone who's not been in this situation before. So for those particular individuals, it's very like, you have the denial, you have the shock, the awe, the just complete like fight, flight, or freeze. They're frozen. So that's been some of the things that I've seen out on some terrible things that have happened.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to it, because I think the distance question is a good one. When we have a large event in the community, small town, city, wherever it happens, the impact is nuclear right there. It's home. It hits hard. And I always teach this, and you've heard it before, in terms of concentric circles. You have the event, and then it rolls out to the state, maybe the region, then the country. When we have large events, everyone's impacted by it to a certain degree. The closer to home, the worse the reaction can be, because it's so visceral. It's right in your backyard. But everybody has to acknowledge that they're terrible things, and you feel badly about them. Certainly, I think resiliency plays a part of it when you hear or see these things. And it's an overused term. How much resiliency do you have? And I know, as a clinician, and just as a person who's experienced some horrific things, you don't know until you're challenged by it. So each person thinks they're strong. I like when firefighters, police, and first responders come in, I can do it. But I can tell you, like, for example, when the officers walked through the school at Sandy Hook, they were changed forever, period. You could have been the best Navy SEAL, Marine, stoic person, man or woman in the world. It rocks your world. So it's different based on that. The other thing that's important, I think, to note, is that if you've had a prior incident that was close to what's happening, that could be a traffic accident, that could be a plane accident, that could be a shooting, it could be a flood, a fire. It's more visceral. It comes right back to the top. We learn to park these things in our lives, and we put them aside until they happen again. Then it percolates up a bit. And certainly that's important to be mindful of. And I talked before about close proximity. If you're in the thick of it, sometimes it's advantageous to remove yourself from it, and how do you do that? We'll talk about that maybe a little bit later on in terms of when the troops come in, because if you have a large scale incident or a shooting, you're probably going to lose a little bit of control over how that is unfolding, and you'll have FBI victims assistance, you'll have FEMA, maybe if it's a natural disaster, you'll have the Red Cross, and a lot of people who are expert in it that are from outside your camp, so to speak, will take your information into account, but they'll run it differently than if you have been directly impacted.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. So let's talk a little bit, if we can here, about what you might be experiencing in this space. So if you are someone who is experiencing grief or has experienced an impact, what do you do, and what do we see people doing? These are not, by the way, healthy things to do, but they are sometimes the stopgaps that we find ourselves in. So the staying extremely busy to avoid time to think, the drinking too much, the sleeping too much, sleeping not enough, all of these things occur. Sighing, the feeling overwhelmed, the lack of energy, losing interest in things, canceling events, not going out, really a change in the normal everyday status. I've often heard from college students who've either been part of or witnessed something traumatic that they have trouble focusing on papers, academic studies. They just feel like, what's the point? Especially with veterans who might be coming back from active duty combat and jumping into a college scenario, they often have some transition issues. Not all veterans, but some, especially coming from active duty combat to back to the real world, quote unquote. It's hard sometimes for them to focus on those things. Now, other times, remember what we said about grief being individualized. Some of the best things we can do is give people a task to think about, some things to engage in, some distractions perhaps. We had a close friend of ours that had an incident with her husband who had a medical scare, and I was working on a project that was, of course, saying like, this is fine, we can do this later. And she was like, no, 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 give it to me now. I need something to distract myself. So I think listening to people, especially when they're able to verbalize, this isn't always the case, but sometimes they can verbalize what they need, is real important there for sure. Here for you. The slides really, I think with a panel like we have here, I don't know that we need a bunch of slides, but there are some good indications here, some good materials that we'll share with you as we move into kind of the next stage of a conversation and the response piece. So, grief is really all of these things. There's no set, I think, stage. We can have someone who's gone through a loss of one person, someone who's gone through a loss of an entire family. Loss depends on our past experience, our resources to help us through this, our general emotional and psychological well-being, our family system, our support system. The ability to go through a grief experience or respond well to a trauma experience depends a lot on our training and the supports that we have around us. All of those things are really important. So we'll kind of end with the rules for grief. I'll keep those a little aside for now, but before we jump into some questions and some conversation, I guess I can pass to either of you. Really, you can take a pick. If there's some basic advice, let me throw a question out there. If there was events, say on a campus, at a workplace, in a K through 12 setting, what are some bits of advice that you might share for either working with the Red Cross, working with first responders, working with teachers? What's been some of your experience in that space? Karen, you want to start us off?
Sure, I'll start. One of the things that I've been able to appreciate from situations like this is just making sure that you're doing the very best job you can do in the capacity that you're there on the scene to do, working as a team with all the different agencies that are going to appear, because that can sometimes be different working with people that you haven't worked with before. That's the first thing that comes to my mind.
And just to expand a little bit, it's really important, only because I've done this since the Twin Towers went down in New York, and I've been in multiple states, multiple places. It's important to kind of meld into, if you will, or mesh with the people that are coming in that have expertise. And I can tell you this, nobody wants to dismiss you. You're local, the people, everything that's happening. Your voice is very valuable, but we're disconnected in a way, and we're organized and trained in a way to do that response on I hate to say it now, but a regular basis nationally. That's for FEMA, FBI, Victims Assistance, Red Cross, any of the agencies or state agencies that would come in. So we need to know that we can partner together and not dismiss. We want to be there together, and we want to roll out the services that could be beneficial to your campus, to your school district, or to your community. And these agencies don't stay forever. So you have to have a plan that will take you beyond the week or two or 3 or 4 that these agencies are helping get people through the motions, if you will. In a large scale event like the Las Vegas shooting, the convention center is opened up, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people come into it. There's places for people directly affected. There's people collecting the belongings of the people that died. All that has to be handled with a great deal of sensitivity, empathy, and care.
Yes.
There's not a college or a school district that practices that, or how do we roll that out? So you want to make sure that that work is done in tandem with input from the community, but rolled out properly. And those are just some of the things to keep in the back of your head, that when it's that traumatic, it truly is that traumatic. And it doesn't make it easier for people like Karen and myself and first responders to walk in there and think like it's just a day on a job. It's never just a day on a job. It takes a piece of you. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of sympathy, a lot of empathy, and a lot of direction. So just make sure your voice is heard. And I think it would be embraced by people that were coming in from the state or the federal government or other communities to assist. So use that assistance.
Well, let's look at a couple rules for grief and then open it up to some general questions. I think that'll be a good place to be here. Some of the rules for grief that we have, and this is, pulled from a number of different handouts, but I find it's useful, talking to some different folks about these issues, but making a point to eat and sleep, even if you're not hungry or tired. I'll throw a caveat onto a couple of these, and then we'll kind of see what Dave and Karen think. But I also think, like, let's not annoy people who've gone through a grief experience by shoving muffins into their face. If someone's like, I'm not hungry right now, that we have a little bit of time before that actually starts to become a life risk. So I think we need to track that and pay attention to it. But I also think let's not, like any rule, let's not go overboard with it. I think that's an important distinction. And while a daily routine, I fought this at the beginning of COVID. If we could see COVID as a bit of a parallel to grief and trauma reaction when we all got like kind of isolated, I really did not have a routine, and I wish I did. So it was one of those times where there was some great advice given by everyone at the beginning of it. And I'm up at 4 a.m. typing and doing work and sleeping till 2. And so, yeah, it would have went better for me if I followed a daily routine. So that's certainly something I wish I did more of. Taking time to be by yourself, but not isolating oneself. So a lot of this is, again, reading the room, talking to that person, getting a sense of what they're comfortable with, how they're feeling. These are interesting, right? And this is another one of these things that I think it's like sort of cooking and making curry. Like if you know what you're doing and you just do a little bit of spice, it's delicious. If you don't, you can overdo it. So I think the reality is, and maybe this is a weird thing to say, and I will take pushback from Dave and Aaron and everyone else, but I do think, having a drink once in a while helps if you're feeling really sad and overwhelmed. I was in a class once where someone implied that any type of alcohol, so a first responder class, after an event was a horrible idea. And I'm like, the room did not respond well to that. It's using that as your only coping device. That's where that problem really kicks in. And the same with the other pieces here. Anything in excess becomes problematic. Thinking about how you're going to remember that person, remember the experience, is especially useful for kids and little ones. And understanding that grief really is a unique experience.
And I'll just tell you, if somebody's predisposed to those activities Brian talked about, that is, they are recovering from substance abuse issues, or they've had kind of a life where they fell into these addictive type things, that can come rushing home again. So that person's more exposed to develop those capacities, if you will, again. So that's something to look out for.
A great point.
Doing all of that in the rules for grief. My bottom line is, at your place, you should watch out for one another. And if you see behavioral change in dress, clothing, speech, anything changes in somebody, it's not their normal kind of persona, ask about it.
Yeah.
Gary?
I was just going to say it takes me back to Sandy Hook, and one of the big pushes with Sandy Hook following the shooting, now that they have all these wonderful programs in place, is if you see something, say something. I think a lot of times we miss the mark on situations or individuals that need our help the most because somebody doesn't say something, and we don't have access to you know whoever it is that's out there that's hurting and in pain, if they don't come forward themselves. So the people that are close to those who are hurting and impacted by tragedy need to say something, reach out, be an advocate for that person.
And Brian, I think we rolled right over into probably the last slide. I'm pretty sure it's about support for the institution as well as support for one another. I think that that's where we're headed, and that's there you go.
Gotcha.
It's the important part. And there's a lot that happens here. I would ask you, and you don't have to answer, just think about it. Where you're working right now? What's your plan if you had a catastrophe on your campus or in your school district or in your community? What's your plan? Who's in charge? And most especially, people don't think about the long term. And Sandy Hook did this very well. Many communities that have been impacted like that, they roll out services over a long period of time. Foundations they spring up, counseling. Even with 9/11, I think the Red Cross had a presence in New York for years after 9/11 because it was such a profound, impactful event. Unfortunately, we see those things not as large as 9/11, but we see those things happen more regularly now in the States, whatever the cause of that is, natural or if it's a shooting or a bombing, or an accident. We see more of it, unfortunately. So these things that you see here, you can read through them. It's about supporting others too, if you have the capacity to do that. That takes leadership. That takes a person in charge to roll out those particular things that can be helpful.
I threw this up for us too, Dave, whether you or Karen wanted to talk through a couple of these before we break for questions and stop the recording, just in terms of coping with grief, the things that you might find for yourself as first responders, as people who are helping. We run into compassion fatigue, the feelings that people doing this work can feel overwhelmed doing the work with others. So I guess either the advice that we give to people individually, what might be our kind of go-to out of this list, and what we do for ourselves to take care of ourselves after responding to this kind of work, which is exhausting, I think is a fair word.
I was just going to focus in on being patient with yourself. To me, that's one of the key factors in resiliency, is knowing that we have minimizations, we have limits. Know your limits. If you start to recognize things, symptoms like stress, your sleeping is getting irregular, those kinds of things, you're withdrawing from your small circle of people that you have, or you may have a large one. Those kinds of things are the things that I would consider, hey, warning, warning, we got to do something else because what you're doing is not working.
There's a lot up here for you to read, and ditto to what Karen just mentioned. I'm going to add one thing to this that's important. It's the fourth one down. You don't have to join a support group necessarily, but running groups over a period of time after the incident takes place is very helpful to lots of people. Not everybody will entertain that thought to go in and sit and have somebody orchestrate a discussion about what happened and how they're feeling, but many people get to express their feelings or sit and listen and watch other people express their feelings that they are feeling as well. Very helpful, has a huge amount of impact. Outside of that, the person that does not attend those things, that is on your campus, in your school district, in your community, who is self-isolating and now has become kind of withdrawn. Again, watching your colleagues, watching your friends, watching people that were impacted is important. And you don't have to be a clinician to go up and say, hey, Karen, how are you doing today? I'm noticing some changes. And I have found that people, when they're impacted by that, by an incident, a large incident, they're respectful and they'll say, thanks for asking, I'm not doing too well. Generally, you won't get huge pushback. Some people say, leave me alone, and that's okay too, but you can't inquire about it. So I think processing in a group and inside of the Red Cross, again, Brian, you said when you're impacted by this stuff, at the end of every day, in a situation like that, we don't let people off a shift without coming together in 8, 10, 15 people and having a discussion. How did your day go today? And we're looking for those signs and symptoms of people that are overwhelmed, that are, delivering services, and for the stories about people that we need to interact with that were directly affected. So I don't, group process doesn't mean group therapy. It means discussion. And you have to lend heart to that and understanding. I know we have a few minutes, Ryan, and you want to get to some open questions, maybe?
Stop the old recording and we'll go from there.